Andiamo avanti. Un solo commento su quello che ha detto il generale Gimondo dal punto di vista, diciamo, dell'esperienza industriale. Lui ha detto una frase: piccoli team e i costi si riducono. Su questo dobbiamo stare attenti perché lo spiral development è vero che favorisce lo sviluppo seguendo un processo che non è quello della cascata, ma è anche vero che è molto difficile da gestire contrattualmente, quindi questo va considerato. Era un punto di vista, va considerato anche l'altro punto di vista. Una battuta sui working group della Nato. La Nato ha creato innumerevoli working group. Si è citato l'Afghanistan Mission Network. Per cambiare il nome dell'Afghanistan Mission Network è stato creato un working group, il quale working group prima, senza cambiare la sigla, ha detto Alliance Mission Network, poi dopo altre riunioni è venuto fuori il Future Mission Network, e finalmente poi c'è la Connected Force Initiative, e questo è stato un grande salto perché è stata cambiata anche la sigla della cosa. Per dire che esistono working group, diciamo, di un certo livello, esistono fortunatamente anche working group di un altro livello, e qui parliamo del working group del Joint CGISR, che è quella struttura della Nato che sta pensando al futuro. E io passo la parola al dottor Wittstruck del USMOD. Un cenno giusto a questo working group, ma il dottor Wittstruck andrà più in dettaglio sul tema. È un working group dove c'è una partecipazione consistente di tutte le Air Force, Army, Navy e Special Operation Forces, quindi portano anche l'esperienza dell'esercizio sul campo. In questa settimana a Roma c'è questo working group che sta lavorando sia questa settimana che la prossima settimana, e abbiamo il piacere di avere il dottor Wittstruck, che è il chairman di questo working group. Lui è responsabile presso il Sensor Hybrid Improving Ground Intelligence Electronic Warfare, e ha un'esperienza prevalentemente sulle attività future. Lascio la parola al dottor Wittstruck. Pardon, morto.
Thank you and good morning. Sir, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to come update you on NATO's activities in this critical area that you all contribute to. So first, let me thank the previous speaker because you've made my job easier. I can use much of your content, and I can use as a point of departure to talk about the implementation of some of the tenets that you spoke to. And the other thing that's rather unique when we talk in joint ISR, no matter where I go in NATO, is the passion that you all bring to it. Because this is a complex problem. And without the passion, we might just say it's too hard to execute. It's too hard to understand. And there are many complexities going on around the world, as we know, not just military, political, economic, as evidenced by my own home nation this week, whose evidence that they too can bring themselves to shutdown based on economy and politics. But this is the growing trend. And we have to manage, we all manage within this, and yet we have to solve these complex problems in ISR. So I'm going to take a few minutes with you, update you a little bit on NATO's activities, and I'll be with you for the rest of the session, and welcome to answer any questions you may have. All right. Okay. The Master of Ceremonies showed this chart. This is the mission of the Joint Capability Group of ISR, formed in 2009 as really more of an efficiency. As NATO looked across its over 400 individual groups, supported by 13,000 NATO staff members, and realized we could not sustain that model going into the future. So they took the land, maritime, and air components and merged them into a joint group, as you see here. At the very bottom tier are the technical experts that all the nations contribute. As you can see, that there's an importance to maintaining the discipline of single intelligence at this technical level, because we still require that depth of expertise in both technical and material. As we move up and we move into the next tier, we see the all-source intelligence integration subgroup. This group was formed specifically because we understand that we're moving past DOTLM PFI, where the I is for interoperability, and now we're beginning to see the era of immersion. As was spoken to earlier, cloud technology, stream computing. Commanders no longer worry about what is the source of my data. What they worry about is the product I need to make a decision available to me? They assume that the technology, working with the doctrine, is providing them answers to questions to gain the wisdom and insight, as was referenced earlier. But this requires bringing together all the single intelligence disciplines and getting them to understand that they must contribute not only in the vertical, but in the horizontal to give the commander a complete picture. And then lastly, this joint capability group. This joint capability group really is the centroid, if you will, for material and technology in NATO for joint ISR. So what has happened in the last year? In the last year, as was referenced earlier, the Chicago Summit took place. What that practically meant to this group was that joint ISR is now the #2 priority in NATO. So with priority comes help from above. And help from above is represented by the 2 blocks that are on the same tier as JCG ISR. The Joint ISR Project Group has just been stood up in the last 60 days as a focus area of leaders, senior leaders, led by a Norwegian Brigadier Peterson, as an advisor directly to the CNAD on all matters in joint ISR, whether they be military or materiel. So they're the bridge between the military committee and the CNAD activities of joint ISR. The JISR Capabilities Area Manager, the CAM, Mr. Ludwig de Kamp. He's part of the Defense Investment Staff at the headquarters in Brussels. His responsibility under this pilot program is now to be the coordinator, the facilitator, and the integrator of all things joint ISR. So he spends his time with the military committee, with the CNAD, and even with the North American Council, making sure that every aspect of joint ISR is now invested, coordinated, and communicated in an integrated fashion. One other statement I'll make here, you see a green box at the bottom. Not necessarily a traditional intelligence discipline, but one that's important to ISR. The Concealment, Camouflage, Deception, and Obscurance Working Group came as a result of land ISR contribution, where it was found that it was important for us to be able to replicate any potential enemy combatant's ability to deceive us, whether it be decoy target, camouflage net. How do we work that into the intelligence collection and processing process so that you don't waste your critical resources as an operator chasing something that is not a real target? So that's become a very critical element, and you'll hear about that later from my colleague, Mr. Rob Monday, who will talk to you about NATO's next joint ISR trial, Unified Vision. So what has gone on in the discipline of NATO process? As you know, some of you are here as members of the NIAG. The NIAG has adopted several studies. A couple of the studies you see here, number 3 and number 5, speak to the fact of working on what you saw in the opening video, open source intelligence, probably the fastest growing yet least mature of the intelligence discipline. Every nation in NATO has some degree of OSINT that they are investing in because it's intuitive, it's prolific, and much can be learned from it, not just in content, but in context. The NIAG is also an important contributor to the trials in NATO. They continue to contribute not just capability to complement the nations, but also to conduct the independent assessments to provide back to the nations how well they're meeting the objectives of ISR. This is a target study that we're actually doing cooperatively with the Joint Capability Group on UAS. And it's really striking to the imagery issue. AGS, as was referenced earlier, is a perfect example. I have NAGSMA over in the meetings on the other side of the city this week talking about AGS and their needs to reduce the complexity of imagery production. As we all know, when you go into theater, there's some wonderful imagery sources. The problem is, what do you do with all of it as an operator? You don't possess the resources to look at all of it. You're lucky if it's cataloged in a uniform fashion so that you can index through it looking for just that 1 or 2 frames of a high-value target. So more times than not, much is left behind, and we lose the opportunity. This study is intended to try to help index and catalog and automate those processes. Because as we get more complex in our sensing, as we get more complex in our processing and exploitation, and we talk to dissemination and its complexities, we must take the burden off the human and leave the warfighter to do what they're trained to do, which is to decide and to act, not to act as a computer processor, constantly trying to make sense of what's being told to them by the systems. As part of that, architecture has become a product in NATO. What you see here is a NATO Joint ISR interoperability framework concept that we have started to advocate across NATO. And what this does very simply is it ties together the NATO integrated intelligence architecture that we are implementing for materiel and technology purpose on the CNAD side. It brings into consideration the operational requirements of the military committee contribution to Joint ISR. And it speaks specifically to the capabilities the nations have committed over the next 5 years that they would bring to a campaign as cataloged in the capabilities matrix. All of these bring us to the advent of what is going to be a services-oriented architecture. Why is that important, and what change does it make for all of us? What it does is it now immerses you in the environment. This is our area of operations as a simple example. Every one of you is an integrated collection, processing, exploitation, and dissemination mechanism. You have similar intent, but you don't have identical intent. Just like commanders in the field, you may have common training, but your command intent may be different than his command intent. But you're served by the same architecture. So you need that architecture to tailor products for your individual use. And that's where the service-oriented architecture is taking us, with many nations making investments in this technology. For those of you who are unaware, there are 4 NATO nations that have already taken on the challenge of stream computing and are demonstrating stream computing both in trial, exercise, and in operations. There's at least 1 to 2 nations that have actually brought cloud computing into Afghanistan and have been using it on the Afghan mission network for the last 2 years. So these are no longer theories. These are practical implementations by nations to try to bring forward an architecture, and with that architecture bring forward flexibility, because it's the agility, the flexibility, the timeliness, the accuracy, but also what we call the volumetrics, the ability to answer all the commanders simultaneously, tailored to their intent. That is required of an architecture. So when you bring forward your future products and technologies, you can't just speak in the content of what it does for your individual community. You're going to need to put it in the context of how does it contribute to the architecture. So we're going to go forward and publish this architecture so that all of you can see what it is NATO wants to accomplish. Why do we do this? We are a community that never forgets that at some point will we be responding to crisis. Crisis may be what we've seen in Unified Protector, what we've seen in Enduring Freedom. It may be more what we saw in Iraqi Freedom of a more peer campaign. It may be civilian humanitarian support, as we've seen recently. The issue at hand is it is a full spectrum threat. And as such, we do not possess the resources collectively anymore to focus large investments on just one aspect. We must cover the entire spectrum of threat. So, as was said earlier, cyber is becoming a consideration and a concern. And we must address that as part of the architecture. In the sensing domain, we have some very mature sensing capabilities, as you're aware. We continue to work in these areas. We're adding phenomenologies as we speak. Measurement and signature intelligence, which is the second bullet here, is now exploding with new capability and maturity. How do we integrate that into more traditional collection? How do we do all those attributes you see in the third bullet while also contributing to a fused complex entity database environment, this architecture? In operations, you see all of this. The previous speaker commented to the convergence, if you will, of intelligence and operations. No longer do we have the 2 and the 3 sitting independent, but working as a team, sharing common views, and with real-time feedback from the operator to the intelligence community of what's needed. Instead of this latency and liaison back and forth, now it's an immersion into a common environment. And you need to think that through that as you bring products and technologies forward. How do you make it transparent, whether it's the intelligence analyst or the operator who is looking at the product that has been produced? Very simple cartoon. What we're seeing more and more as we move forward as a NATO response force is we're seeing the need for persistence area assessment. We cannot show up in a campaign void of any a priori knowledge. So now we look for not just situation assessment or threat assessments, we look for patterns of behavior, prediction analytics, human terrain analytics. Afghanistan was a great lesson of how much time and investment we made just defining the tribal relationships and where we had alliance and where we had potential threat. We're going to see as we move forward from this experience that we need to be able to look forward into an area of operations and have some idea of all of those complexities and share that across the coalition so that we can target our capabilities. As the situation develops, we will continue now to use capabilities like NATO AWACS and AGS to continue to refine the situation and threat, to build the target folders as required, and to hand that off to operations. In our last trial, we had 3 nations bring forward fighter jets. Their primary purpose was a tiger meat. Their secondary purpose was to serve as non-traditional ISR collection assets, who contributed significantly to the red picture. That's going to continue, to watch those operators interact with the intelligence collection managers and feed back to them that this is what I can contribute to the picture, but I need you to change as an intelligence community for me to understand what it is you want. And then to move from there to effects, whether they be kinetic or electronic, and bring it forward finally to a mission overwatch profile. Transport is key, network is key. This is just a small list. You heard about FMN earlier. The draft mission profiles for FMN have now been published within NATO headquarters for staffing. Their first step is just simply, just like in Afghanistan, entrance and exit criteria to join and leave the network, a federated network. Because the first step must be federated, because there are so many sunk cost investments in networks by the nations, we cannot ask them to set those aside and start over. So we have to work on the administrative rules. We have to work not just on, is the pipe big enough to move the data, but what is the quality of service we can provide to the end user? Even if it's a disadvantaged user, can we characterize the quality of service of what they can and cannot get? Because they need to build effective TTPs. And as I've been through many theaters of operation in 25 years around the world, the one takeaway is the best commanders I meet are not the ones that focus on the strengths of what's being provided to them, but on the limitations, so that they can build an effective TTP and not have false expectation of what's being provided. Other enablers, we talked architecture, standards, we've talked to, STANAGs, AEDPs, joint trials and exercises. What's really taking a different flavor here is when we did the Trial Hammer series of trials, they were focused on a single intelligence discipline for technical interoperability purposes only. Now as we move to unified vision and we work with the MAGIC community and the CWIX community, we're seeing more and more the integration of technical and material interoperability in an operations context. So we are still meeting the intent of validating the STANAGs and demonstrating the technical interoperability, but doing it in the construct of an operations relevant scenario that's being defined by the military committee, so that the operators can understand how this all fits into their intent. Finally, CCIRM, if there are things you need to think about moving forward, how do we do dynamic CCIRM more? The advanced tools that support these emerging CONOPS. We talk about we're going to be reutilizing ICMT as a NATO force. A great tool, but now how do you integrate that tool and have it work with the nation collection management and CCIRM tools in a seamless way? Common service-oriented architecture. You're going to hear this again and again and again. The previous speaker referenced it. I guarantee you other speakers will reference it today. The architecture is crucial because the architecture is the foundation for us to be able to project capability in the future battlefield. Multi-intelligence fusion, we hear fusion. I've heard fusion for 25 years. And it's gone from sensor fusion to data fusion to services fusion to applications fusion. And the answer today is yes, all of that. Common services, common applications, CSDs that are open enough that you don't even know that you've taken data from the CSD. It's just there, and you're able to manage and use it. And then lastly, this whole issue of focusing the trials and the exercises as a critical path to support the NATO response force. The consideration is, yes, we must satisfy technical interoperability and material interoperability. Yes, we must build the discipline of STANAGs and AEDPs. But more importantly, we have to remember that we're doing all of that so that operators can be effective and efficient in the resources they're given. So by working closely with the military committee, we end up doing that because now I have operators looking through a reticle of practical operations employment of these assets and how they fit in a larger OODA loop. So I thank you for your time. I welcome any questions you may have throughout the morning. And that is the end of my presentation, sir. Thank you.